Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Now back to my regularly scheduled and formatted album reviews. Let's talk about an older one. The newest record from Kirin J, Callinan, called Bravado. Okay, one thing that I've enjoyed a great deal in the internet era is that it started to break down some of the first boundaries of what pop should sound like, at least outside of what's defined in the mainstream. And while of course I'll have an appetite for some of the mainstream pop stuff, I like hearing voices or tones that might use some of the pop framework, but would fly in the face of what's traditionally acceptable in the genre, even though that definition has definitely evolved with time. But no matter what era of pop it is, I don't think an act like Kirin J. Callinan would have had an obvious place, especially if there's going to be any sort of radio crossover. And sure, a big factor of that is how he fused ramshackle guitar and piano together, or the lyrics that leaned explicitly political and more nakedly sexual in an interesting way that pushed more towards punk or maybe even freak folk. But the biggest factor was his voice. The most obvious comparison, both given his shared Australian lineage and his low guttural howls, is birthday party era Nick Cave. But instead of gothic trappings, Callinan pushed towards a brawny, wild-eyed, but sharply incisive brand of synth and guitar-driven pop that wouldn't be that far removed from some textures you'd find in the mid-80s, except a little bit more jittery on that first album called Embracism. Now that was 3 years ago, and this time for Bravado, he brought in an even bigger cast of players, recruiting from the underground acts like Weyes Blood in order to flesh out more of his sound. So okay, what sort of spectacle did we get around for this sophomore project? Well, here's the thing. This is one case where I'm actually feel quite glad that I'm not part of any critical establishment with a reputation or that's inclined to pass broad judgments on what is considered good taste. And I only bring that up because the most common headline from critics talking about Kirin J. Callinan's Bravado is that it defies good taste, and that the instrumental aesthetic of this album is composed mostly of early 90s pop archetypes, big beat electronic music with a modern synth palette, and the glossy melodrama of easy listening. It's the sort of music that most critics wouldn't dare catch themselves enjoying 25 years ago, much less so today. So you can see the market hesitation for so many of them to admit that they actually might like this record. Now, I don't need to have that hesitation because I completely understand what Callinan is doing, and I like the central gimmick of this project. And I say gimmick because it doesn't quite work all the way through. Not quite taking the central idea to transcendence in the same way that an artist like his conceptual peer, Ariel Pink, can do at his best. And you know what? I think the Ariel Pink comparison actually is kind of valid here, and yes, I'm looking forward to covering his album in a couple of weeks. Both are pulling their tones and aesthetic from what many would consider the cheesy junk of pop culture, refining the often rock-solid pop core, and then giving it a distinctly weird and distinctive feeling with the writing. Now, Callinan doesn't quite go as far as Pink in the instrumentation and production, yes, we will come back to this, but it's not hard to see that with his vocals alone, he would replicate a similar feel overall. He's not quite as bellicose or as raw as he was on his debut, but that does make a certain amount of sense, especially given how many guest stars he's singing opposite on this project. Now, the one that I immediately recognized was Weyes Blood on Friend of Lindsay Morrison, but I was most impressed by the artist that actually stepped up to actively duet with Callinan instead of playing more backing vocals. Like Star on This Whole Town, she really has some powerful and impassioned vocals there, or especially Alex Cameron on Big Enough, mostly because it showcases a lot of great chemistry. Although I will say that I was amused that longtime Ariel Pink collaborator Jorge Elbrecht shows up for telling me this. But one of the unfortunate factors of bringing on so many guest stars outside of duets on an equal footing is that they do serve to soften some of Callinan's edge, so we don't quite get as many standouts like S.A.D, which is Song About Drugs, which is pretty much a case study of Callinan at his weirdest and personally most expressive and strongest. And a big part of all this is also backed by the composition, because let's face it, for this sort of material to work and not just feel like a goofy parody of cheesy early to mid-90s music, or worse, feel like a pastiche of it, it needs to take some chances with the production or composition, and believe it or not, this actually happens. S.A.D is the best possible example. Yes, the constant key shifts can be kind of jarring as hell as first, but it's a compositional choice that fits Callinan's tendency to go for broke in the most direct way possible. It fits that 90s aesthetic, and his delivery definitely supports it. Similar case for the squonking guitars and glossy synths that flips up for a key on the verse of Living Each Day that I kind of really love. That's supported by that synthesized vocal layers that are just a shade too tight to go for the guitar solo. I kind of wish it had tried. Or the subtle gallop anchoring in the guitars that brings in accents of strings or swelling dance melodies at the best possible times on Big Enough. Love that song, especially given its utterly absurd howling finale. Unfortunately, maybe it's an issue of some of the production not quite having the rich orchestration or budget or even the drive to go bigger, but it often feels like there are songs that don't quite take off with the same power as they really could. Friend of Lindy Morrison, again, it's got a lot of the groove and the bass line, but never quite hits the explosive swell it could. And Family Home takes a gorgeous slow build with the rich vocal harmonies, and yet never quite pays off the atmosphere with a bit of an underwhelming close. And while I do like the tight syncopated grooves of the title track, that is this weird whistling squonk that kind of fits the awkward swell of the song, it works for Callinan. I think a slightly better tonal choice could have paid off all that drama so much stronger. Hell, where the tone actually becomes the biggest issue is on Down to Hang, full of wiry, skittering rattles, nervy blasts of noise, and a choppy disco groove that contorts across the middle of the mix that definitely matches the confrontational tone of his infamous collaborator, James Chance, but for as dark as it can get, all that nervy tension never really hits a break point or really explodes the way it could. But on the flip side, you have Tellin Me This, which might embrace the easy listening keyboard melodies, the chimes, and the crooning backup vocals a little bit too straight-faced. And sure, it's definitely pretty, and all the subtle guitar embellishments and the horn show a lot more going on in the composition than you would otherwise expect, but let's get real. If you gave this to Michael Bolton or Richard Marx 25 years ago, I doubt so many of you could really tell the difference. But of course, that's part of the point, which takes us to a lot of the content and the themes. And you know what, here's the thing. While the Ariel Pink comparison kind of works for the compositions, a better one for a lot of the content would probably be Meatloaf or the writing of Jim Steinman, in that it's a deliberate retro camp callback that's also willing to take some of the piss out of itself while actually trying to make a meaningful statement. Bat Outta Hell, that did it for the 50s, Bat Outta Hell 2 did it for the 70s, and Callinan here is doing it for the 90s, albeit using a lot of contemporary language because that's how you make those sort of themes feel more relevant to today's population. And that's kind of the odd thing. Just like on Embracism, Callinan is most interested in exploring masculine roles in the modern world, both in the areas where they deserve some thorough subversion or where they might still have a very real place, and I actually appreciate that. On the one hand, you get the exasperation of Down to Hang, where instead of an implied hookup, he's the one that's getting strung along by her autonomy in all the different ways that she might be capable of hanging, or Song About Drugs, where controlling impulses go out the window, and the drug trip becomes less of an empowering escape and more of a careening mess. But on the other hand, letting go from violent impulses on Living Each Day has rarely sounded so joyous, and Big Enough, it skewers hypermasculine cowboy culture by implying that despite all the posturing, the world really is big enough for all of us. Now, that's not saying that there isn't a place for masculine figures. The father is a constant figure on Callinan's Family Home, and it's not saying that his role isn't needed, just that it needs to evolve for the current time. And there's a similar case for the romance that's made across the connections of Tellin Me This, or the anxious waiting on This Whole Town. It's just that the record is self-aware enough to call out overwrought bravado at its core, while recognizing that, yeah, it kind of has a place, and when rooted in true vulnerability and honesty, it paradoxically carries so much more power. There's a reason that the recognition of some vestige of fame and success on Friend of Lindy Morrison comes right before the title track just lays it all bare. However, this might be where the musical genre aesthetics and history can kind of clash with some of Callinan's messaging, because it's not like easy listening or big beat EDM were genres that were dominated by masculine archetypes, especially in the early 90s, especially in comparison with the hard rock or hair metal or the rise of gangster rap. So while it might emphasize Callinan's tendencies towards being a sensitive romantic, and I can kind of appreciate that, there is some tonal consistency. The mode of messaging could have maybe carried a little bit more transgressive weight if it better matched some of the content. But you know what? Overall, I got no problems with saying that I like the hell out of this. Thematically, it's an advancement and refinement of what Callinan has previously explored, and while I do think he could have utilized some of his guest stars a little bit more, or paid off some of the climaxes with a little bit more intensity and power, especially in his vocals, he does have a solid sense of groove and melodic progression that will definitely serve him well in a big way going forward. And I cannot deny how catchy and potent some of these melodies are. The music might be a little bit kitschy, but god damn it, when it works, it works. It's the sort of indie pop that that will not be for everybody. Hell, that voice with this style of writing, that will do a plenty on its own. But you know what? There's a certain raw sincerity that pulls me in regardless, netting a light 8 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation if you haven't heard it yet. It's a weird listen, and yeah, I did get to this a fair bit later than I wanted, but hey, definitely worth a listen. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to see what you thought about this record, I know I'm covering it late, but the poll's up there. I'm curious. If you want to buy the album, highly suggest you should. It's interesting. Links in the description below. And if you guys want to get more involved in basically supporting me and more involved in my schedule, the link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add records or even movies to that schedule if you're in the higher tiers. And really, I wouldn't bring it up as much as I do right now, except that with all the demonetization stuff going on with YouTube, which pretty much hits all of my videos right out of the gate, it can get a little bit exasperating. I would really do appreciate it, because you guys get involved in some of the voting, that gets pretty fun. And hey, I do cover the albums that land on that schedule. Beyond that, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.